Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this opening session of our new webinar series called What You See is What You Trust. My name is Anders Fogh Rasmussen. I'm the founder of the Alliance of Democracies Foundation and the co-chairman of the Transatlantic Commission on Election Integrity. Our commission has been engaged in multiple ways, raising public awareness about the risks of foreign election meddling. These days, most of us are preoccupied by the COVID-19 pandemic, and none of us might have a clear idea how the world after Corona will exactly look like. But what is obvious is the same patterns as we have seen in election meddling. The coronavirus is followed by a so-called infodemic. Russia, but even more China, is pushing their narratives or amplifying the general mood of insecurity and mistrust of citizens towards state authorities. So our mission to fight disinformation, which is intended to undermine our democracies, is more relevant than ever. For this reason, I would like to thank our partner Microsoft and its Defending Democracy program, which supports our new three-part webinar series on disinformation and deepfakes. We would appreciate if you all could join us too in our efforts to defend democracy. And I wish us all a fruitful and inspiring discussion today and in the coming weeks. Thank you for tuning in.
Hi, my name is Olaf Böhnke. I'm the Senior Advisor to the Transatlantic Commission on Election Integrity. Thank you everyone for joining us. This is the first webinar. This is the second attempt to use actually the Teams webinar software, which did not work. So therefore, sorry for the inconvenience to switch to Zoom last minute. We're very glad that you're all here. Before we jump right into the debate, I wanted to quickly share a couple of housekeeping announcements for this webinar with you. As you can see, this is all on the record, and we will put it just in case you can't watch it until the very end, or you have no time, or you want to recommend it. We will put it on our YouTube channel and edit it a little bit so it looks then more professional than it might be live, but hey, this is exciting. If you want to pose questions after 30 minutes of panel discussion, we will open the floor. Use please the chat function here. Indicate, if possible, who the question goes to, or if it's a specific speaker or to all. Our team will help the moderator actually to highlight the most relevant questions, and we want to post or forward as much as questions as possible. So bear with us if yours is not with us, then it was just an issue of time. And that's already it. I give the floor to our moderator, Eileen Donahoe, who is a member of the Transatlantic Commission on Election Integrity. She's also the executive director of the, oh, now I need to get it right, sorry, Global Digital Policy Incubator at Stanford University. She's an expert on disinformation and deepfakes, and we're looking very much forward. The floor is yours, Eileen.
Thanks so much, Olaf. Let me just start by welcoming the audience. Thank you for being with us. In this seminar series, we have Microsoft's Defending Democracy program joining forces with the Alliance of Democracies for the purpose of helping protect the integrity of democratic elections worldwide, especially from foreign interference, but also from the many various forms of digital disinformation and viral deception online, whether text-based, simple fake versions of manipulated video, or more cutting-edge synthesized audio video known as deepfakes. As Anders must have alluded to, one of the challenges for democracies is that we believe in open information environments and free expression. And these commitments make us strong, but also vulnerable to new types of manipulation, particularly in the digital information realm. And while interference in elections through disinformation is a global phenomenon, I will say the 2016 US presidential election certainly was a major wake-up call for all of us. I think most people were caught off guard, and we simply failed to anticipate that disinformation could be such a potent weapon in an election context. Many of us, all of the speakers here, have been preoccupied with this threat ever since. We now accept that disinformation is a society-wide challenge that we must confront together. Governments, private sector, academics, professional journalists, civil society, and citizens. We also recognize the ever-evolving nature of the threat, which continues to morph before our eyes today. And we have to come to fully appreciate the very complex set of policy dilemmas that we're confronted with by disinformation, especially in democracies. No doubt the 2020 US presidential election will be a very important battle in this long war. And the question we need to ask is, what manifestations of the threat are we failing to anticipate now? What can we do to get ahead of the problem and mitigate the risks? In today's conversation, the first of this series, we're going to focus on the role of the private sector in combating disinformation. And we're going to look at what they're doing now and what we think they could and should be doing. Before we get to our experts, we're going to have a very brief presentation by Erika Greene, who is a software engineer and a non-resident fellow with the Transatlantic Commission on Election Integrity. She'll do a level set of what the digital platforms are doing about disinformation generally and deepfakes, and then we'll go to our experts. Erika, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. I am here broadcasting from New York City, where it is morning. So I'm going to share my screen. Let's do this. Can someone give me a thumbs up that everyone can see? Yes, okay, great. So hi, my name is Erika Greene. My day job is that I'm an engineering manager at Etsy in Brooklyn, New York. I have a very short presentation just to frame the discussion that we're going to be having about the policies that big tech platforms have come out with around manipulated media and disinformation. So just to make sure we're all talking about the same thing, when we talk about big tech in this context, we're primarily talking about social platforms, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter. These platforms allow people, users, to upload various user-generated content, sometimes referred to as UGC, which could be text-based, video-based, live video-based, images, all different types of content. And almost exclusively, none of this content is reviewed by humans before it is uploaded to these platforms, although sometimes content is subsequently reviewed or taken down. And the kind of broad question is whether this model, which is fairly new in terms of information content distribution in the world, is this model a threat to democracy? And you might be thinking, how is this so different? Why is this so different than the way information spread before? And so, Aunt Marge might be sharing conspiracy theories with her friends before Facebook existed. She used to tell them, share all this stuff. What's so different now? And there's many things that are different, but one of the key differences is, of course, the scale, but also that these conspiracy theories, disinformation, manipulated media are now shared alongside the news on many of these platforms. That they've combined and merged news sources, quote unquote, trusted news sources, traditional media sources, with opinion and all this UGC, user-generated content. So I just wanted to highlight this important difference, which I really think is worth talking about, that it can be confusing to people and it makes people think harder. You have to now think about what is true and what is not true every single time you consume a piece of media, content on these platforms. And furthermore, the platforms are incentivized to show engaging content and news, not all engaging content is true, and they are arguably anti-correlated. So this is a great quote by Jay Rosen, who's professor of journalism at NYU. He says, from the point of view of targeting ad companies, false information is just as good as true information, even better in some ways. That's the fundamental problem. And it is key to remember that all of these social media platforms are advertising companies. Okay, so what if they fact-checked these posts? Great idea. This is a quote from Anil Dash, who's an entrepreneur, an activist, and CEO. So he says the incentives are misaligned here because these truth teams, the truth squads within these companies, is only ever going to be a cost center. They will never make the company more profitable, which is another key thing to remember in this debate. Which brings us to deepfakes. So what are deepfakes? Broadly, they are videos generated by AI that can be indistinguishable from a real video. They will likely further erode people's ability to trust the authenticity of content online. There's currently no general method for detecting deepfakes. This is an interesting thing we could talk about here, but it's arguable that there never will be. And companies have responded to this threat in many different ways. And one of them is they're funding research into being able to detect these types of videos. Okay, this is just a broad overview of the different platforms we're talking about and what their current policies are. The key thing I wanted to call out is that Facebook has a very narrow policy around taking down manipulated media. It has to be proven that it's a quote unquote deep fake, meaning an AI system generated it, not a cheap fake, meaning that it was just manipulated through non-AI driven techniques. And none of the platforms currently are pre-screening content for authenticity or will provide a timeline on decisions to take down this content. So that's the state of the universe, that there's many policies. All these companies now have policies around manipulated media. I would argue they're largely ineffective considering that they don't focus at all on prevention, but it is heartening that they're taking this threat seriously and have at least acknowledged the problem. So that's all I have for you.
So much, Erika. So basic points are that we have a mix of news and user-generated content. We have no human review, pretty much. We're depending on machines. And then the core business model of user engagement also comes into the mix. Obviously, a lot of tensions between the desire to have authenticity and also permit free expression. Absolutely. So we're going to move now to our experts. Let me briefly introduce them. Hany Farid is a professor of electrical engineering and computer science at UC Berkeley. Prior to that, he was chief technology officer and co-founder of 4 and 6 Technologies and a professor at Dartmouth College. Ashish Diamond is director of technology operations at Microsoft, and he's a leader on their cybersecurity and democracy team. And prior to joining Microsoft, he has a vast experience in the technology realm. We are honored to have both of you. I want to basically just give you guys a chance at the top to lay out your broad take on the disinformation threat, whether deep fake, cheap fake, text, whatever, and its implications for democracy. And then you each get a chance to lay it out, your deepest concerns, and then we'll get into the more specifics. So Hany, you go first.
Sure. Thanks, Eileen, and thanks, Erika, for that. So setting us up nicely for that. So I've been thinking about this issue of authentication for over 20 years now. And 20 years ago, in the early days of the internet, my focus was really on the courts of law, the evidence. How do we assess truth in a court of law when the stakes were high? And you have to think back to late 90s, early 2000s. The internet was not what we have today. And over the years, what has happened is the implication of getting that right has grown in terms of severity and scale and a sense of urgency. So we went from the courts of law to, a couple times a year, citizen journalists reporting on events going around the world, to today, where on a daily basis, on an hourly basis, we are dealing with threats to democracy, to society, to women, to our economic security, and to now, most recently, to our health. And so things have really escalated in the last 20 years, and they've escalated for a number of reasons. One is obviously the underlying technology is incredibly sophisticated and ubiquitous, and that is largely good, of course, right? Technology has been an amazing thing for our society. But there's also has been this dark side of technology, and the hard truth is it works. The misinformation, the disinformation, the lies actually work, whether it's for fraud, whether it's for sowing civil unrest, whether it's interfering with democracy, it works. And so it continues and it is escalating. The things that worry me in the realm of misinformation, disinformation, deepfakes are a number of things, and let me enumerate them in no particular order. The first, and I think the biggest threat that we've seen to deepfakes is to women in the form of non-consensual pornography. So if you look at where is the biggest today impact of deepfakes, it is in the creation of non-consensual porn that is impacting the lives of thousands, tens of thousands of women around the world, and that is a serious threat that we have to sort of get our handle on, number one. Number two is threats to our economy in the form of, I create a video of a CEO saying profits are down 10%. I can manipulate the market to the tune of billions of dollars. Number three is the sowing of civil unrest and divisions within society by creating, highly, highly polarized clans, by feeding people misinformation that conforms to the worldview. And as Eileen was saying earlier on, of course, is threats to our democracy. And what is one of the hardest things to deal with in this space is that this is a multi-dimensional problem. There's, of course, the people creating this material. There's the platforms that are, allowing or, not able to control it. There's us consuming it and amplifying it. And then there's, of course, the technology that sort of fuels all of that in the creation of misinformation. And so I think the solutions have to also look multidimensional. They have to be policy changes, they have to be legislative changes, and they have to be technology changes, and they have to be educational changes. And the last thing I'll say is, back in the day, 20 years ago, when I was dealing with authentication issues, I would have days, weeks, months to do analyses, right? You go into a court of law and you'd have this incredible luxury. And today we have seconds. The half-life of a social media post is measured in hours, not days, not weeks, not months. So when things hit, they hit hard and they hit fast and they're over within a couple of hours. And so to add to the 500 hours of the scale of 500 hours of YouTube video uploaded a minute, the billion uploads to Facebook a day and the hundreds of millions of tweets a day is the speed at which we have to operate. And that is a huge challenge from a policy, legislative, and technology side. So those are the things that I worry about, is the implications to individuals, society, democracy, the speed at which all of it is happening, and the multidimensional nature of both the problems and the solutions.
That's great. So what I hear from that is that the old mantra that happened, I got in law school, that when there's bad speech, you just need more speech to counter it, is not working.
I love that line, Eileen, I really do. And I wish it was true, but here's the problem with it, is that would be true if the online marketplace was an open marketplace, but the problem is it's not, because of the nature of algorithmic amplification, right? The nature of speech is that when I put speech out there, it doesn't reach everybody equally, right? It reaches selectively. So hate speech is designed to reach people who hate. The correcting speech never reaches them. And even if it did reach them, and if it could fix things, but let's put that aside, the problem is it doesn't, because we live in these echo chambers because of the nature of the way the Facebooks and the Twitters and the Googles and the YouTubes and the TikToks of the world work, which is that they have a recommendation engine to keep you engaged. So I wish that was the way the world worked, but I fear that it is not.
Yes, so the speed, the scale, the way algorithmic amplification works means that there has been this massive escalation in the consequences, the deterioration of civic discourse.
Exactly. And I'll say, by the way, and I don't mean to be an alarmist about this, but I fear that if we don't, as a society, have a base factual system that we agree on, that is a fundamental threat to democracy. Right? Because we can have different opinions, we can choose to interpret things differently, but if we can't even agree that this happened or that happened, we are in a lot of trouble as a society. And I think that's been part of the problem of why we and other nations are becoming more polarized, because we can't even have a conversation anymore because we don't agree on even basic facts anymore.
Yeah, okay, that's great. Very helpful. Okay, Ashish, let's give you a chance to lay out your concerns.
Well, so Professor Farid actually laid it out very well from a concern perspective, or the issues that we see: deterioration of truth, the trust, decay, as Professor Citron and Bobby Chesney put out. One thing is that, and I'll echo what Professor Farid said, is the echo chambers and the algorithmic design of platforms where, the business model conflict, inherent business model conflict, essentially, where the falsehood is spread faster because of the innate nature of or human tendencies versus doing the right thing. But I want to take a step back and say, I think, yes, this is a big problem, and this is coming very fast at us from all kinds of dimensions. And I would also agree that this is a multi-dimensional problem, and it would require multi-stakeholder solution, right? So it cannot be solved by a platform company in silo, or a legislative solution, or a regulation solution, or civic societies. But it has to be a kind of, everyone has to work together. And the bottom line there is to identify the problem. And to solve any problem, you have to first come to a terms that this is a problem, or have a common taxonomy of the problem. And I think that is missing as well. All synthetic media is not bad, right? In fact, there are examples, or I'll say more than 95% of synthetic media use cases with every technology, right? There's good and bad, and technology can be used for awesome goodness, right? And especially synthetic media, giving voice to people who have challenges with their vocal cords, right? You can generate synthetic voice. Art and expression, creating numerous, encouraging ways to engage kids so that they learn better, right? Using synthetic media. But then we cannot, just focus on the goodness. You have to actually see what the challenges are, because that 5% of malicious use of that synthetic media actually poses a big problem, not only to individuals, as Professor Farid said, to societies and democracies at large. So we, when we look at this issue area, Microsoft, we again go into, we have three lenses we look at. One is internal policy. What can we do, Microsoft, can we develop a policy position ourselves? But again, we have platform which go from cloud to client to, we engage users on social platform. We encourage developers to build solutions using GitHub and put code there, to cloud platform like Azure, which enables everyone to develop and create and share code and solutions. So we have to be mindset of the nuances of differences in technology that we have, but we also are thinking about having a policy position ourselves. The second thing we look at is public engagement. What can we do, both as a leader as well as a contributor to this issue area? Raise awareness, partnering with other peer industry groups like Google, Facebook, Twitter, and others, as well as civil society groups, and in some cases also engage legislation and regulatory authorities in countries, because they are the ones who eventually would come up with all kinds of regulations. And then the third thing, which being a software company, we also look at the technical countermeasures that we can bring or contribute towards this issue area. So that's how we look into this. As yes, there is a problem. There are really good use cases, and then for malicious use of synthetic media, deepfakes, misinformation, how can we support and help the ecosystem?
Great. So you both underscored the multi-dimensional nature of the problem and the fact that we basically then need cross-sector collaboration to attack the problem. What I'm curious about is, how does that work from your point of view, given the different business models and functions, identities of the different platforms involved? And also I would ask, let's go back to Erika's presentation. What's your assessment of how the companies are performing on the levels you talked about, their technical ability to combat, but also on their internal policies? Because there seems to be variability and incompleteness there, as well as the third layer of public engagement. How would you assess the various companies doing on those layers? You talked about Microsoft's commitment. What else is happening?
So I can start there with some of my thoughts and I just echo what was said earlier by Professor Farid as well as the advertising model itself. That has like, it creates rewards for platforms to have people engaged, right? And we also know that data has shown us uh, that falsehood, provocative content is shared faster at a speed and it's more engaging and grabs attention. So this what has happened is this has resulted in a system where fakes thrive and truth suffers. Right. So every platform, and I'll go back to this, that yes, there is a business model conflict and incentives built into the system. But I also strongly believe that platforms do consider more than business models as they start navigating this, infodemic parlance, right? Which is the malicious synthetic media, deepfakes, misinformation, and the harm that it creates. The platforms are cognizant of the fact. Now, every platform has their ways and means to tackle this problem. Some are taking a very hard stance, like I'll give an example again from Microsoft. LinkedIn has a very public policy of not allowing any deepfakes on our platform, versus Twitter is doing pretty fantastic. They day before actually started talking about not allowing disinformation on COVID. Facebook is also trying to navigate it very, very carefully from a business and policy perspective. So from a policy, I think everyone is trying to figure out how it impacts their business model, as well as what is the right thing to do, because at the end, all platforms do also understand that this is a trust economy, right? Short term, yes, the business model conflict arises, but in long term, the trust is the biggest currency here. And if you lose trust in the short term, long term business models would be threatened as well. So there is that motivation that the platform companies do think about. The other aspects of it, like cross-industry collaboration and participation in civil society groups and others, I've been part of many of those meetings, where we have representation from peer industry groups. One of the examples is the Deepfake Detection Challenge, which I think we'll get to at some point in this discussion as well. But I think the bottom line here is that this is so fast moving. It's coming to us at a speed where everyone is trying to figure out, and I strongly believe that platforms do consider more than business models when they start thinking about this.
So I'm going to turn to Hany, but I'm going to underscore something that I hear in your comments, Ashish, which is that in the context of an infodemic, that ultimately crushes the business model. I mean, if you are in a trust economy and the way your business is working is destroying the information realm, ultimately in the long game, that's not a good business model. So I'm curious, Hany, why don't you speak to whether you think the platforms are catching on to that long-term threat, and generally your sense of their performance, whether technically or policy-wise?
So I think almost everybody agrees that things have improved. I mean, if you go back to pre-2016, Mark Zuckerberg saying fake news had nothing to do with it and really was very dismissive. We've come a long way to admitting that there is a pretty serious problem on all of our social media platforms. And that's a good first step, I think. I think the platforms have taken sort of varying steps, but and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, but I want to also reemphasize what Ashish was saying, is that there's real tension here when you have an attention economy. And Microsoft doesn't suffer from this as much as the YouTubes, the TikToks, the Facebooks, and the Twitters, which are basically an ad-driven attention economy. And the other attention, and there's a question about this, which is the tension between an open and free internet and mitigating the harm that we are seeing, and that's the other tension that we have. So let me tell you very concretely a few things we've seen. So we are just finishing a 16-month longitudinal study of how YouTube actively promotes misinformation and conspiracy theories, right? And I want to distinguish here, and this is a really important distinction, particularly when we get to the issue of free expression and free speech, right? Which is that you may have the right to have a YouTube video up or a Facebook post, but you don't have a right for YouTube or Facebook to algorithmically amplify that and recommend it to other people. So what you should know is that on YouTube, 70% of all videos watched are promoted by YouTube. So that's the watch next or recommended for you down the right-hand column. So all the action is in these recommendation engines. And so when YouTube says, hey guys, watch this misinformation, watch this conspiracy, watch this hate video, they are the ones who are promoting this material. They're not just hosting it. So here's bad news and good news. The bad news is in late 2018, as we looked across a broad section of informational channels, so these are news channels, upwards of 10% of the recommended videos by YouTube were conspiratorial. 1 in 10. That's insane. That is an insane amount of conspiracy videos. Now, in late 2018, YouTube announced we're going to do something about what they call borderline content. Not much happened for 3 months. And then we saw a very fast, precipitous drop, and it is hovered now between 3 and 5% of recommended video on informational channels are conspiratorial. I don't think it'll surprise you to learn there's been an uptick in the recent COVID-related crisis just because of all the actions going around there. But it's still hovering at around 3 to 5%, which I would argue is still a very, very high number when you think about that these are literally being promoted, not just neutrally hosted. So there's a little bit of good news and bad news. The good news is it's not as bad as it was. The bad news is it's still pretty high. Now, if you look at Twitter, for example, they have started to put in some safeguards in place to try to deal with misinformation. Facebook has been sort of some good, some bad. So for example, Facebook has continually doubled down on this notion that not only can politicians lie, but they can micro-target those ads as small as they want. I think it's fine to say, and this is what we were talking about earlier, Eileen, is that, sure, let politicians talk, lie, don't lie, but don't allow them to do the micro-targeting. That's the issue. That's what I take issue with. And I think that was a bad decision, and that should be reversed. On the other hand, YouTube and Twitter have said, we can't do political ads right, we're out of the business. And Jack Dorsey, you should give him credit for being the first to say that. So I think it's a little bit of a mixed bag, and I think the enforcement is sort of, rough. I think the reality is, and I'll finish here and give Erika some time to chime in too, is that, there is this tension here with the business model. And Ashish, of course, is right that that's not the only thing that drives business decisions. But it is a big part of profits is engagement. And engagements are at odds with what we were talking about because the sensational, the conspiratorial, and the outrageous engage people more. And everybody admits that, and there's a large body of evidence to that. And so, one of the things that as we were talking about this multi-dimensional problem is maybe we need to start fundamentally rethinking the business model of social media. Because I would argue that is sort of probably the underlying poison that everything is derived from.
That's great. I'm going to give Erika a chance to jump in, but I want to underscore a couple things. I think you said you framed things very well. Users have a right to post. They don't have a right to have their material algorithmically promoted. And then that is on the platforms. It's their decision, essentially. It's their decision.
Yeah, and look, you could, and of course, you don't have the right to post anything, right? Non-consensual porn, things that are illegal, of course, right? But here's, because what you'll hear from the platforms is, well, the internet is big, there's nothing we can do about it. I'll give them that excuse, but when it comes to your algorithms deciding what to promote to the users, which is what they're seeing, you have 100% control over that, and that I don't think we should give them a buy on.
Right. And it goes, so that's also, it's like money in the pocket. If you're promoting, it goes to the business. Sure. Similar micro-targeting ads is money in the pocket, and that's up to the companies because sure. It's themselves. Okay, so Erika, why don't you jump in and give us your take?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really important point, the recommendations. And having worked at tech companies, basically the views of content and the consumption of content is always so heavily skewed. It's always a few things that go viral, a few articles that everyone is reading, a few, shops that everyone is buying from. And then there's this very, very long tail. And so of course, it's hard to scale moderation, but you don't really need to have a large impact. You don't really need to scale to all different kinds of content. There's an 80-20 rule in most cases. So I think that when you're thinking kind of practically and operationally about how you might address some of these problems on these platforms, I think that's a really important point to bring up. And question of personalization is really interesting, actually, because there's these recommendation systems. Everything's personalized in some way. You know, search is personalized in some way. The recommendation algorithms, the ad targeting. I work on personalization systems and training them. It's, you put a ton of data in and out comes things that you don't totally understand. And I think that we have to think about that holistically, because when you start talking about sort of regulation is the wrong word, but sort of if you were to improve the quality or moderate in some way content that is consumed, you very quickly start having to think about how that impacts your product and personalizing your product. And it gets a little sticky, but I just wanted to make the point of the 80-20. And I think that these platforms start to think about different categories of content, essentially. You know, when we're talking about elections and what is really at risk and what is really a threat to election integrity, it's not all of the content. It's the content that's going viral about politicians. You know, if some random celebrity, there's a deepfake about them, that is not a threat to election integrity, probably, but there is a set of content that is, and that probably should have much different moderation rules around it. And I don't know any platform that has come out, at least publicly, and had these different categories for different types of content. I'm curious if either of you have seen that.
Yeah, I mean, you even saw Facebook on the other side of this with the Nancy Pelosi video. So there was a fake Nancy Pelosi, not a deep fake, right? All they did was, I mean, in some ways it was brilliant. They just slowed the video down. By the way, try this at home. I've taken videos of myself since then and slowed them down, and you sound just stumbling drunk. It's fantastic. But it was not meant to be satire or humor. It was meant to be, this is news. And in fact, the White House retweeted that video saying Nancy Pelosi is drunk, impeach her. And Facebook said, we have no problem with this. So that was, I thought, and by the way, I think YouTube took it down and Twitter was silent on it. So I think that they've actually stumbled on, and those are the canaries in the coal mine, right? That's an off election year, and they got it wrong on those issues. So I think there is still, the policies are not very well established, and certainly in the enforcement is not even close to being uniform.
You guys are hitting on what is one of the biggest tensions, because Hany, you made the point, you have the right to post, you don't have the right to promotion. So we're getting into the difference between the power of the platforms to take something down versus allowing it to go viral or pushing it to go viral. And when do we want the platforms to have the power to actually take it down, especially if the content is not illegal? And certainly in the United States never would be illegal. And even under Article 19 of the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights wouldn't be illegal. So this gets us into the question of, do we want the platforms to have that power if the government couldn't do it itself?
Look, so let's get a few things straight. They do have the power, right? You don't have a constitutional right or a First Amendment right to post on Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, or Twitter. The First Amendment protects you from the government, not from a private entity, okay? On a routine daily basis, these companies take down perfectly protected legal speech in terms of adult pornography. Facebook does not allow adult pornography. YouTube does not allow it. They take it down on a day-to-day basis, and nobody's jumping up and down in their head saying, you're violating my First Amendment right. That is their right as a private company. Now, having said that, these social media companies have taken a very central role in political dialogue, and therein lies the tension around political speech, right? Which is that if you don't allow a candidate to be on Twitter, YouTube, or Facebook, are we interfering with democracies? And I think that's a fair question, and one that we have to sort of come to grips with. And I think part of the problem is that the social media sort of grew so quickly. They went from mom and dad sharing images of their kids and grandkids to political candidates doing what they're doing today. And this all sort of mushed together. And I think we haven't quite figured out how to deal with these multi-dimensional aspects of social media that started off as one thing and have morphed into another thing. And I think we just got to get better at it. I think we have to find ways of compartmentalizing content. I mean, the fact that your news feed has everything from the grandkids to news stories to political, like that, it's just a mess, right? And I think that's sort of one of the things that we haven't quite come to grips with. But that is a real tension of, how do we allow just the right amount But look, I'll say that we deal with this in the real world all the time, right? We have limits on speech. You don't have an unlimited, unfettered access to speech in the physical world. And because the internet is so new and it's a different medium, we just haven't sort of come to grips with it. And I think we have to deal with the culture and the education and the legislative policies in order to sort of bring the online world back into alignment with the offline world and have that balance. And look, we're never going to get it perfectly right, but I would argue right now we're skewed in the harm's direction. And I don't think that the threat right now is that we are stifling speech. I think the threat is we're doing more harm than good. So I think we have to sort of rein it back in a little bit and sort of keep figuring out as these technologies evolve.
So I'm going to ask a tough political question. I'm going to start with Ashish, sorry, which is the challenge that we're facing because one of the people who is involved in pushing political disinformation happens to be sitting in the White House. And he is, pushing what are clearly fabricated videos that are even known to be cheap fakes and having fun with it, even underscoring the fact that they're fake. So I think it's really a tough call for the private sector to say that they are taking down the political speech of the President of the United States, given that it's not technically illegal speech. So how do we deal with that very tough challenge? Ashish, do you want to start?
Yeah, so, I can start, and without, going into specifics here, right? I'll say, there are a couple of challenges. One is, the truth decay. I think one side is, promoting misinformation, disinformation with an intent. But the long-term view here is eventually get people and their trust in the news and generate uncertainty, more or less, right? That, so it may not be specific to this a particular cheap fake or a shallow fake, but a long-term implication to the whole idea of democracy here and trust, right? And it does accomplish that goal, right? It can come from any side, but eventually, as leaders practice these kind of activities, eventually get to a point where citizens' trust in democracy and institutions erodes to a level where what they see as we say, what they see they don't believe, what they hear they don't start believe anything. So where do what's our role into as a private sector, as a technology company? And I think this is where we have to step up, to start thinking about awareness and education of so again, we have data to show that falsehood spreads more quickly, more fast. People actually get engaged more. So instead of trying to rein into that falsehood, if we start thinking about how do we educate voters, populations to understand the long-term implications of this, and in short term, how do they manage the falsehood that are coming at them, right? And then that may require us to actually start thinking about what kind of media literacy programs or educational programs, awareness programs we bring to market as private enterprises, because that's our responsibility as well. And again, the private enterprises these days are bigger than many countries' GDPs, right? So essentially, they have with great power comes great responsibility. I think it's our responsibility to do the right thing. And as we start thinking about education and awareness, we also think that there has to be a set of norms there as well, by which not only for technical peer industry groups, but also civil societies and other groups, to come up with a basic set of norms, and these are the right things to do, right? And it's not enforcement of regulations, but come to a common platform of state thinking about, if you are thinking about awareness, then what are the right ways to actually deliver that awareness, right? What are the right ways to engage the users? And that can very well be in the form of norms and community guidelines, desirable behaviors, positive expectations of users, and all that can be clubbed into, which can, along with the awareness, can go a bit farther.
Okay, so I'm gonna let Hany and Erika answer, but I'm gonna give you the chance if you want to go at that tough political question about the president. But also, I want to highlight what something Ashish just brought up, was really that we have a tension between two different liberties: the free expression, which we always emphasize, and I am on that side of the equation, but the intention with that is the right to democratic participation and the ability of people to simply engage in civic dialogue around elections is being destroyed, and those things are in tension. So speak
okay.
for them.
So unlike Ashish, I have tenure, so I can tackle this problem with less fear. So look, I think you raised the right question, and I don't want to be political about this or partisan about this, but I think it is true that this White House, more than others in history, have been promoting clearly false narratives. And how do you deal with that? And so, so what are your options? One is you say, okay, that's the way it is, right? The other option is you say, okay, you're not allowed to do that. And the third, and I think neither of those really work. So here is my sort of perhaps straw man solution to this. And I come back to, again, this notion of algorithmic amplification, is that if the president is going to lie, he should have to lie, or she should have to lie to everybody uniformly. So that is, if a president's statement shows up on my Facebook feed, it should show up on yours and yours and yours, right? Uniformly. And that's true of political ads too, right? If you want to lie in a political ad, that's fine. You can get called out for it, but everybody should see it, right? And so that way we're all sort of on the same page. I don't think that, Trump supporters should see his false statements at a higher rate than I do, for example, or that you do. So I think that notion of keeping things, sort of balanced, so we're all on the same page here, and we can all respond and deal with that, may be the compromise. I don't know that it is, by the way, but I don't like either of the other solutions, right? Shutting it down, letting it go rampant. So maybe that's the compromise, right? Is that political speech by political candidates has to be treated differently than what my, grandmother, says to me.
That's fascinating, because the whole political world is based on micro-targeting, even pre-digital.
And I don't think it should be. I don't think it should be. It's fine if you want to micro-target ads for cars and products. That's fine. I don't have a problem with that. Although, and by the way, we have exceptions for housing and jobs. You are not allowed to selectively target ads for housing and jobs. And there's reasons for that, right? Because at least a discrimination. So surely we can agree that the political ads and political speech should share at least a common ground with them.
That's great. Erika, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I strongly agree with that. YouTube is kind of moving in that direction a little bit. They've limited the number of categories that you can use to target political advertising, but I think it's just for national elections. So anyway, some platforms are moving in this direction. I completely agree that you shouldn't be able to micro-target political advertising. There's a lot of details of if you actually wanted to implement that in a way that was effective because of PACs in the US, a lot of, and different levels of elections and different bodies, and we don't actually even require the level of transparency necessary to implement that policy effectively. So it's an interesting question, but I completely agree that that's the answer. I don't think, if I was running Twitter right now, I don't think there's an easy answer about enforcing your President Trump is definitely violating some of their policies. If they banned him, people would just retweet exactly what he said in other platforms. There would be, I think, kind of practically no real difference, and it would just cause a lot of drama. So I don't think that, I think they're in a hard position, and I am sympathetic for them, to them about this. But I do think a lot of this comes down to the political speech question comes down to targeting. Yeah.
May I play not the devil's advocate, but the people's advocate, because we have a lot of good questions in the Q&A section. And given that we only have 10 minutes left, so it will be a squeezy exercise anyway. But maybe shall I just highlight some of them and you pick actually whatever you're comfortable with? There was a good question asking, what's the best response on social media to fakes? Label them or take them down? So I think you touched a little bit on them, but the labeling issue, I know that Ashish is very keen on that, is an interesting one. Then there's a very general question, does the panel think that deepfakes will play a role in the US 2020 elections, and if so, how? Another question is, assuming Facebook continues in its policy to allow political figures to post false or misleading content, what level of targeting would balance incentivizing truth through broad exposure with the need to advertise to interest audiences? And maybe a last one that was in the beginning. How do you strike, and I think this may be too general and the meta question here, but how do you strike the right balance in practice between removing illicit deep fakes, but still protecting free speech and avoiding over-moderating online content? So I leave it with that. And maybe we're going 5 minutes over time, so sorry for that. Back to you.
Can I address the question about whether I think deepfakes will play a role in the election? So the short answer is I don't know. I don't think it's out of the question, but here's the thing I worry about more, and this is why I wanted to answer the question, is what I worry about more than the actual creation of the deepfakes is what Danielle Citron calls the liar's dividend, right? That once we enter a world where images and audio and video can be manipulated, everybody has plausible deniability. Anybody can say anything is fake, and we have seen this. And to give you a sense of how fast the landscape has changed, in 2016, when then candidate Trump got himself in trouble over the Access Hollywood tape, he really struggled to figure out how to respond to that. Now, a year later, he said, oh, I think it was fake, let's move on, right? That's how fast the landscape has shifted. And so now imagine a world where damaging footage, images, audio, a video of a candidate or coming out, they cannot say, hey, look, it's not real, it's fake. And to me, that is the larger threat of deepfake technology, is that liar's dividend, is that we no longer will be able to believe anything we see and hear, because when you add people's ability to have plausible deniability with, again, the echo chamber and this sort of hyper-partisan space, that's the thing that I worry about for the 2020 elections.
Yeah, and just to jump in on that, I agree with that. I think one thing that is really not helpful is when the tech companies put out tools to help journalists determine if something is true or fake. It implies that media companies and journalists don't know what is true and fake, and that they are just spewing false information out there in the world, which is not true at all. Facebook is definitely guilty of this. Google and Jigsaw is guilty of this. Journalists don't need help doing this. I mean, potentially, but they don't need to be pandered to. I used to work at the New York Times. I know the level of rigor they take to fact-checking things, and also they know these politicians, where they are. They have public schedules. Like if they're randomly showing up in a place that they didn't actually, there's no other evidence that they were at. I mean, there's ways that you can determine whether something is true or false without just analyzing the bits in the video. So this narrative of like, oh, we're going to help you build tools to the journalists to determine if something is true or fake is really, really unhelpful and making the problem worse.
Yeah. So I'm gonna, Erika, just on that point, the last point that you mentioned, I just want to actually provide an alternate view, which is, I don't think that the idea here is to actually tell the journalists that it is fake or not, but give them tools so that they can quickly figure it out. So again, not figure it out, but use that in their own forensic pipeline, essentially, for some scale and speed reasons, right? Again, I'm not saying that they need the tool. I think just from a scale and speed reasons, there may be some tools which can be helpful, right? And
that's generally not how journalism works. That they have a stream of amazing, huge amounts of content and video, and they're constantly pushing it out without fact checking. I mean, that's generally not how this works. And also, that's not the problem. I mean, media companies don't really have a problem with disinformation. They generally fact check. I mean, there's some examples. Nobody is perfect, but they, for the most part, that's not the problem at all. And there's the amount of emphasis put on like building tools to help experts who take this incredibly seriously and are trained in fact checking and to have a whole range of tools, which are often like call people up and ask for statements, right? I think it just muddies the landscape. It confuses people. It's a similar thing with it's a similar thing with taking things down versus just labeling them, it's confusing to label it. No one knows what a deepfake is. No one knows what probably this might be, unverifiably true or false. I mean, it's just going to confuse people. So I don't know. I don't think it's helpful. Having seen journalism work firsthand, having worked with journalists, I don't think it's helpful. I'm curious if you get requests from media companies and journalists for tooling. I don't think that would be top of their list. But
quick answer is yes, we do, right? And again, it's not to give them a binary answer of fake or not, but help them to from a speed and scale perspective. But I want to go back to the other question that was asked, which is labeling and removal. So when we think about the countermeasures, right? We can measure them, or we can actually think about two key strategies. One is reducing exposure of misinformation, and the other is reducing belief of misinformation, right? So reducing exposure, meaning, hey, you just remove the content. So if nobody sees it, then you remove the exposure, reduce the exposure. But the other side, which is reducing belief, I personally think that providing labels actually is one of the good strategies if your goal is to reduce belief in that misinformation. But then again, there has been some research both by Facebook, Twitter, and others in academia, as well as what kind of labels are more effective and what kinds are not, right? One of the examples is the pre-exposure warning are more effective than the post-exposure, right? So if you provide them a label saying, hey, what you about to see is fake, right? Then it is more effective from that perspective. Simple labels are more effective. So again, I'm just repeating what I've read, from the studies. But the idea there is labels can be effective, but they also have to be used in the right way, on the right content. Like providing a label on a video may not be as effective versus providing a label on an image, right? So those are some.
So I have to jump in and say that I don't think there's as much of a problem in professional media not understanding what's a fake. But I do think they too have a business model problem where they are seeking eyeballs, and they report on things in many ways like entertainment value. And you certainly saw that in the 2016 election in terms of all the coverage of the hacked docs material becoming the centerpiece of reporting of places like the New York Times, which was a big factor in the disinformation realm. And we can't let that fact go unnoticed. I think we have to close, but I have to give you guys a chance to talk about the basic technical challenge of combating deep fakes and the cat and mouse game, and who's ahead of the curve, the people synthesizing or the people doing detection. So say a few words about where we are on that technical challenge, and what was the deepfake detection challenge itself, and was it effective?
So let me just chime in on the overall, field, and then I'll let Ashish talk about the deepfake challenge. So, this is very much, as you said, Eileen, a cat and mouse game. It's like spam and malware and viruses. The synthesis gets better, the detection gets better. Before I tell you where we are, let me just say what the end game is. So the end game is the forger wins. We know this, right? The forger is always going to be able to create a compelling fake that I can't detect. But the level of skill and time and effort required to do that is going to become prohibitive for the average person on the internet, and then we will call that a success. So our goal is not to prevent the creation of fake content, but it's simply to make it more and more and more difficult so that you take it out of the hands of the average person, and then so it's a more manageable threat. So I would say right now that there are, of course, many, many more people working on the synthesis side than on the detection side. That's just generally true. I would say that the last 1.5 to 2 years, there's been some very nice techniques for detecting deep fakes that are now some nice speed bumps in the road. But these things change month to month. Every 3 months there's a conference in computer vision, machine learning, computer graphics, and you see yet a new wave of technologies. So it's a very fast moving landscape. I would say that it's hard to play defense in this space because the tools are getting easier to use, they're getting more sophisticated, and of course the delivery mechanism is so effective. And then I come back to what I started by saying is that not only do we have to play defense, but we've got seconds, minutes to play defense, because once that content goes online, it's game over, right? It never comes off. And so not only do I have to, detect these things, I have to do it very, very fast. And that is the biggest challenge. You give us time, days, weeks, months, we'll figure it out. But we don't have time. And that, I think, is going to be the big challenge going forward.
Yeah, so I'll echo what Professor Farid said. The detection is one side, which is you can think of as a reactive measure to this. There are proactive solutions as well, which industry is working on, especially around authentication and provenance, right? But that, again, is a long-term solution to this whole idea of truth decay. You have to have the users trust the source, right? And that's where authentication provenance can play a part. From a detection perspective, I think the Facebook detection challenge was a good step in the right direction, right? It did achieve raising some awareness, absolutely, about the issue area, and also tried to bring researchers and tech companies together to solve a big problem. The challenge, as Professor Farid said, is it is very hard to solve, right? We don't have enough time, right, in a couple of seconds to even detect. So detection has to happen as a pre-step before the content can be loaded, and that again gets back us into the territory of business model conflicts and reduction of belief, or remove the things, right? And it's hard. But one of the key learnings that came out of the Facebook detection challenge was the key one was detection alone will not solve the information integrity challenge, and the shallow fakes and deep fakes are actually, at this point in time, are even a big problem from an infodemic perspective, right? Low tech manipulation, which we talked about, miscontextualization of images. So that was one of the things that came out of that challenge is that hey, detecting in a video is awesome, right? That researchers will get excited about it, but the real problem at this point in time is shallow fakes and cheap fakes. And then the other thing is the access to these detection tools, right? If it is just for the platforms to improve their mission, it doesn't serve us all, right? There has to be an access to journalists, to civil society groups, and other folks, even researchers, to improve upon that.
Can I add one more thing, Eileen, to this question too, is that there's two ways to think about authentication. The way Ashish and I have just been talking about, which is you just sit back and wait, content comes in, you authenticate, and you make decisions on policy, difficult decisions. The other way is sort of what we call control capture, and is an active approach. So what we do is you use a so-called control capture software. So instead of the normal app on your mobile device, you use a specific software that at the point of capture reaches into the content, creates a unique digital hash, puts that on some distributed immutable ledger like a blockchain, and then you can authenticate that content at any point in the future. So it sort of switches the role. So instead of me, the receiver, being responsible for authenticating, I say you, the person recording, should be responsible for authenticating, and then I can trust down the line. And then if the Facebooks and the YouTubes and the Twitters of the world say, well, we are going to prioritize trusted information, well, then you switch the priorities, right? And then people want to be trusted as opposed to being sensational and outrageous. And then that's a big change. So that technology exists today, and we could just change the way we think about who's responsible for authentication, the person recording it, which actually makes more sense, or the millions of people receiving it.
Super helpful. Very interesting conversation. And we're over time. I need to hand it off to Olaf, but thank you guys. And Erika, super interesting conversation.
Thanks, Eileen.
Thank you.
Yeah, let me join you in thanking all the panelists, including the moderator, for a super interesting hour. Sorry for the bumpy start in the beginning, so we will definitely fix for the next webinar the technical issues we faced. And there will be an edited version, as I said, on our YouTube channel, where you can watch our chairman of the Transatlantic Commission on Election Integrity giving his welcome address. We had to pre-record it because he had another appointment. But we will also share a post-event survey with all registered participants, and we're really looking forward to your recommendations to give us some more ideas what you're interested in. This is the good news. This is the first out of 3 webinars we're doing in cooperation with Microsoft's Defense Democracy program. This one was now how the private sector and the platforms responded to the challenge and the threat of deepfakes and disinformation. The next one, next week on the 20th of May, same time, will be on how we can increase media literacy, media competence, especially in hyper-polarized societies like in the US, for instance, where it's so much more difficult to get the message out there, to teach people, because it's very different what people understand when they hear the expression of disinformation and who is lying and who's not. So we will tackle this next week, and then the week after, hopefully, we will announce this on our social media channels. There will be a webinar on the governmental responses so far. So the question is, legislation and regulation, a sophisticated answer to this, because a couple of questions in the Q&A section have been exactly tackled to this. And so you have unfortunately to wait for 2 more weeks, but then we have excellent experts on the panel like Laura Rosenberger from GMF and Lutz Güllner, for instance, the head of the strategic communication section in the European External Action Service, who can then give some good answers on that. In general, as we outlined, the mission of the Transatlantic Commission on Election Integrity is, on the one hand, to raise awareness about the threat, the real threat actually, which comes with disinformation and other operations to undermine the belief of people in democracies, but also to bring together stakeholders, academics, policymakers, tech people to discuss. And I think this we accomplished today in a very interesting way. So therefore, stay with us. And as a last announcement, usually we used to invite the world to the Copenhagen Democracy Summit in June. But this year, given the current pandemic, so we turned this entire conference into virtual. So we have on the 18th of June, a one-day workshop with democracy activists from around the world. We have, for instance, Hong Kong's democracy activist Joshua Wong with us, who will share interesting experiences from the democracy movement in Hong Kong. And the day after, on June 19th, we will have Madeleine Albright, John Kerry, the former Prime Minister of Australia, Malcolm Turnbull, talking about issues related to democracy, also tech issues. And we will also launch our Global Democracy Perception Index. So make sure to visit our website, the Alliance of Democracies.org, and to get more information, to register. And as always, follow us on all social media channels. Thank you very much again to the panel. Have a great day, everyone, wherever you're watching us. And thank you all for joining. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.